A noble marriage could remain perfectly intact, while the husband's heart quietly belonged to someone else. The wife still stood beside him at ceremonies, her name written in law, her position protected by tradition. Yet beyond the halls where society watched, another presence often filled the hours of private thought and whispered conversation. She held no title, signed no document, and left almost no trace in history. Yet her influence could shape decisions that altered entire households. Tonight, we step into the quiet spaces behind noble walls to discover how someone with no position could slowly become impossible to ignore. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, adjust the pillow to fit your head, maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere, and let's begin this journey together tonight. If a visitor had been invited into a noble wedding hall in the early modern world, the scene would have looked impressive, almost reassuring. Long tables were arranged carefully beneath candlelight. Family banners hung from the walls, and guests gathered in heavy garments that rustled softly as they moved. At the center stood the bride and groom, surrounded by relatives whose interests stretched far beyond the happiness of the two people about to marry. To the gathered crowd, the ceremony marked the beginning of a respectable union, but to the families who arranged it, the marriage meant something much larger. Among the nobility, marriage rarely began with affection. It was first and foremost a structure designed to hold together wealth, land, and alliances. Contracts were drafted long before vows were spoken. Estates were counted, titles examined, and the advantages of the match weighed carefully by fathers, uncles, and advisors. The couple themselves were often the least powerful voices in the arrangement. A marriage could unite two large estates and prevent decades of conflict between neighboring families. It could secure influence at court or restore fortunes weakened by debt. Sometimes it ensured that a title remained within a certain lineage rather than passing to distant relatives. In this sense, the wedding ceremony functioned less like a declaration of love and more like the sealing of an agreement. Once the vows were exchanged, each person stepped into a role that had already been defined. The husband represented authority beyond the household walls. He attended councils, negotiated with other nobles, and oversaw the lands and incomes that sustained the family's status. His public actions carried political weight, and his reputation shaped how the entire household was viewed by the wider world. The wife held a position that was just as visible, though very different in nature. She embodied the legal and social stability of the marriage. Her name appeared beside her husband's in records and correspondence. She supervised servants, organized the rhythms of the household, and ensured that guests were received with the proper dignity expected from a noble residence. Most importantly, she secured the future of the family through children. In official terms, her place within the household was unquestioned. At public events, she stood beside her husband. At religious ceremonies, she occupied the seat reserved for the lady of the estate. When visitors arrived, it was often she who represented the grace and order of the household. Everything about her presence signaled legitimacy. Yet legitimacy did not always guarantee emotional closeness. Within many of these marriages, personal feelings were treated as secondary concerns. Families had spent months or even years arranging the match. Land had been promised, dowries negotiated, alliances balanced. Once the agreement was completed, few people expected the couple themselves to redefine their purpose. Affection, if it appeared, was considered fortunate but unnecessary. What mattered most was that the structure remained stable. This attitude shaped daily life in ways that are easy to overlook today. Husbands and wives might share the same house, but rarely spend long periods alone together. Their conversations often revolved around responsibilities rather than private thoughts. The presence of servants and relatives created a constant layer of formality around them. Even small gestures were influenced by etiquette. The result was a marriage that functioned efficiently, but sometimes lacked the warmth modern observers might expect. Two people could fulfill every duty required of them while still feeling distant from one another. From the outside, however, nothing appeared unusual. Visitors saw a well-ordered household. Tenants saw a powerful family whose authority remained secure. The church recognized a legitimate union, blessed by tradition and law. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work. But human emotions rarely fit perfectly inside carefully constructed systems. When marriage becomes a framework for property and alliances, the personal needs of the individuals inside it can slowly drift into the background. Over time, the absence of emotional connection may begin to feel less like a temporary condition and more like a permanent feature of the household. In such circumstances, attention becomes a powerful and unpredictable force, because when affection is not expected, even the smallest hint of it can begin to feel extraordinary. And sometimes that attention does not come from the person who legally holds the position within the marriage. The marriage remained a stable structure built on property, alliances, and family expectations rather than personal feelings. Within that structure, the wife held the public and legitimate position that defined the household's order. Yet when emotion quietly retreats from a marriage designed only for stability, someone else may eventually step into the space that silence leaves behind. Noble marriages that appeared strong and orderly from the outside often contained a quieter reality within their walls. The husband and wife shared the same house, the same table, and the same responsibilities. Their names appeared together in records, letters, and family histories. Servants recognized them as the unquestioned center of the household. Yet presence did not always mean connection. Inside many noble homes, husband and wife spent much of their time moving through separate routines. The husband left early to attend political duties, estate management, or social gatherings that reinforced his influence among other men of rank. Long hours passed before he returned, often late in the evening, carrying the weight of obligations that had little to do with the domestic life waiting behind the doors of his residence. The wife remained within the structure of the household. Her responsibilities were constant, but largely invisible to the outside world. She supervised servants, ensured that meals appeared on time, organized visiting schedules, and maintained the quiet discipline expected of a respectable, noble household. Every detail contributed to the family's public reputation. But these duties rarely created opportunities for personal conversation, even when husband and wife occupied the same room. Etiquette shaped the way they interacted. Noble life was governed by a web of manners that controlled speech, posture, and even emotion. Servants often remained nearby, moving silently through the room as they cleared plates or refilled glasses. Their presence discouraged the kind of open discussion that might reveal private thoughts. In such settings, conversations remained careful. Questions revolved around estate matters, family obligations, or news from the wider world. A husband might mention a dispute over land boundaries. A wife might speak about preparations for an upcoming visit from relatives. These exchanges maintained the practical functioning of the household, but they rarely moved beyond necessity. Over time, the absence of deeper conversation created a strange kind of quiet distance. It was not hostile. There were no raised voices or dramatic conflicts. Instead, there was a slow reduction of emotional attention. Two people could share a home for years while gradually learning less and less about each other. Even moments meant for relaxation followed strict patterns. Evening meals were conducted with dignity rather than intimacy. Guests might remain at the table for hours, discussing politics or trade, while servants carried dishes in and out of the room. The husband and wife performed their roles flawlessly, offering polite responses and maintaining the appearance of harmony. Yet the atmosphere remained formal. It is difficult to imagine how persistent formality shapes human relationships. When every word is filtered through etiquette, spontaneous curiosity begins to disappear. The husband may stop asking questions that feel too personal. The wife may learn to keep certain thoughts unspoken because the setting never invites them. Gradually, silence becomes familiar. Many couples adapted to this condition without complaint. Society did not expect marriage to provide emotional fulfillment. Stability, respectability, and the continuation of family lineage were considered far more important. As long as these goals remained secure, few people questioned the deeper quality of the relationship itself. Still, human nature rarely ignores loneliness forever. In households where conversation between husband and wife remained limited, each person quietly sought other forms of connection. The wife might spend long hours speaking with relatives, companions, or trusted servants who understood the rhythms of the house. These relationships provided small moments of warmth within a life defined by discipline. The husband often found companionship elsewhere as well. Social gatherings, hunting parties, and extended visits to other estates offered opportunities for relaxed conversation. Among friends, he could speak more freely than within the formal atmosphere of his own household. Laughter came easier when etiquette loosened its grip. But even these environments did not always provide the kind of attention he might quietly desire. There remained a subtle difference between public companionship and personal understanding. Friends might share jokes and stories, yet they rarely listen with the same patience required for a deeper connection. Inside the household, meanwhile, the distance between husband and wife remained unchanged. They still appeared together during ceremonies. They still fulfilled their responsibilities with quiet efficiency. From the perspective of society, their marriage continued to function exactly as it should. But beneath that orderly surface, a quiet loneliness persisted. Two individuals, connected by law and expectation, could live side by side while experiencing life as separate emotional worlds. The marriage remained intact, yet something essential within it had gradually faded. And when emotional presence fades inside a structured relationship, attention begins to search for a place where it can rest more naturally. Sometimes that search leads beyond the boundaries of the marriage itself. Noble marriages often maintained their dignity and stability, while emotional attention slowly diminished within the household. In the quiet distance between two legally bound individuals, loneliness could settle without ever disrupting the appearance of order. And when loneliness begins to linger long enough, even the smallest gesture of understanding may start to feel far more powerful than duty itself. Within many noble households where marriage had settled into routine and distance, a different kind of presence sometimes began to appear. It rarely arrived dramatically. There were no sudden declarations or public disruptions. Instead, it entered the household quietly, often disguised as something entirely ordinary. A visitor, a companion, a woman who seemed to move easily through the rooms of the house without attracting much attention. At first, her presence appeared harmless. Noble households were rarely quiet places. Friends of the family came and went frequently. Distant relatives stayed for weeks during travel. Ladies accompanied one another during long visits that filled the winter months when roads were difficult. And social life moved indoors. Among these movements of guests and acquaintances, one individual might gradually become more familiar than the others. The husband might speak with her casually during dinners. A brief exchange in the drawing room might stretch into a longer conversation. Laughter might appear where silence had once dominated the atmosphere. Nothing seemed improper. In fact, such interactions often felt refreshingly simple compared to the strict patterns governing marriage. A mistress did not enter the relationship with a legal contract, a dowry negotiation, or a family alliance waiting behind her. She carried none of the formal expectations that surrounded a noble wife. No estate depended on her behavior. No relatives monitored her role within the household structure. Because of this absence of obligation, her presence often felt lighter. Conversation could move freely without the extreme caution that shaped interactions between husband and wife. There was no need to maintain the delicate balance of family interests or political alliances. The exchange could remain personal rather than strategic. This difference created a subtle shift in emotional atmosphere. The husband might notice that speaking with her required less effort. Questions could be asked without concern for how they might reflect upon family reputation. Stories could be shared that would feel inappropriate within the formal setting of marital conversation. Gradually, attention began to focus more easily in her direction. A mistress also offered something that structured marriages often lacked: individualized attention. Within a noble household, the husband was rarely the center of intimate conversation. His position demanded authority rather than vulnerability. Servants obeyed him. Relatives negotiated with him. And his wife interacted with him through the carefully managed language of household order. The mistress, however, could listen differently. She might ask about his frustrations with estate management. She might express admiration for decisions others treated simply as duties. Her interest could appear genuine, attentive, and personal. These small gestures carried surprising weight. For someone accustomed to speaking primarily about obligations, the experience of being heard as an individual, rather than a figure of authority, could feel unexpectedly comforting. Over time, the mistress's presence began to resemble a quiet form of refuge. The world of noble responsibility remained demanding and rigid. Letters required responses. Financial matters demanded careful oversight. Social expectations never relaxed their hold. The husband moved constantly through a landscape of duties that defined his public identity. In contrast, time spent with the mistress felt separate from that world. Conversations did not revolve around alliances or inheritance. The tone was lighter, the atmosphere less controlled. The relationship existed outside the rigid structure of family obligations. It became a private space within a life otherwise governed by public roles. Such spaces rarely appeared dramatic to outside observers. A conversation lasting slightly longer than expected. A walk through the gardens accompanied by quiet discussion. A chair was drawn a little closer in the corner of a drawing room, while other guests spoke among themselves. Each moment appeared ordinary. Yet repetition slowly transformed these moments into habits. The husband might begin to expect her presence during gatherings. A room that once felt dull now felt lively when she entered. Days that previously passed in a predictable routine gained small interruptions of interest whenever conversation drifted toward her. No laws had changed. The marriage remained exactly as it had always been. The wife still occupied the rightful position within the household. Her authority over domestic life remained intact. Her legitimacy unquestioned by church or society. But emotional attention was beginning to shift in quieter ways. The mistress did not replace the structure of the marriage. She did not claim its responsibilities. Nor did she inherit its public authority. Instead, she offered something far less visible. A private breath of air inside a tightly controlled environment. And sometimes that small breath of freedom was enough to change where a man chose to spend his attention. A mistress often entered noble households quietly, bringing a form of companionship untouched by the obligations that defined marriage. Her presence offered personal attention and ease in a life otherwise shaped by ceremony and responsibility. Over time, when a private refuge begins to feel more comforting than a formal partnership, the direction of a man's attention may begin to move in ways few people immediately notice. In many noble households, nothing visible changed when a mistress entered a man's life. The marriage remained intact. The wife continued to hold her place beside her husband at formal dinners, religious ceremonies, and public gatherings. Documents still carried her name. Servants still addressed her with the respect reserved for the lady of the estate. From the perspective of society, the structure of the household remained perfectly stable. Yet something quieter had already begun to shift. Attention, unlike law, rarely announces its movement openly. It drifts slowly, guided by habit and comfort rather than contracts or traditions. A husband might still fulfill every public duty expected of him. Yet the person who truly held his attention during private moments could gradually become someone else. The wife still occupied the position of legitimacy. Her authority within the household was visible in countless ways. She organized the rhythms of daily life, oversaw the work of servants, and maintained the dignity expected from a noble residence. When guests arrived, it was her presence that reassured them that the household remained orderly and respectable. But authority in public spaces does not always guarantee influence in private ones. Within the quiet rooms of the house, the direction of attention often revealed a different reality. A husband might begin seeking certain conversations elsewhere. Small decisions that once passed naturally through the routines of marriage might now be discussed with someone who stood outside that structure. These changes rarely appeared dramatic. The mistress did not sit at the head of the table. She did not receive guests as the lady of the house. Her name was absent from contracts and property records. In every formal sense, she possessed no recognized position at all. Yet influence does not always depend on formal recognition. In private conversations, a mistress could occupy a role that the wife no longer held. She might be the person who listened when frustrations were expressed about estate matters or political difficulties. She might be the one who heard complaints that would never be spoken during a formal dinner beside the lawful spouse. Listening, in such circumstances, became a quiet form of power. The husband might begin to ask her opinion casually, perhaps during a walk through the gardens or a conversation held away from the crowded rooms of the house. Her responses might appear thoughtful or sympathetic in ways that felt easier than the structured exchanges that defined his marriage. Over time, these moments accumulated. Advice offered casually could influence how the husband viewed certain people within the household. A passing comment might alter his opinion of a servant, a relative, or even his own wife's decisions regarding the management of domestic affairs. None of these interactions appeared significant on their own, but together they created a pattern. Gradually, the mistress became a familiar point of reference in the husband's thinking. When a difficulty arose, he might find himself wondering what she would say about it. When a plan required discussion, her reaction might become more important than the predictable politeness of his lawful spouse. The wife remained present. She continued to fulfill every responsibility expected of her. Guests still saw her seated in the proper place. Servants still carried out her instructions. To the outside world, the household appeared unchanged. Yet presence is not the same as being heard. Within the private life of the marriage, her voice might slowly lose its influence. Questions that once passed naturally between husband and wife might begin to disappear. Decisions that once required shared discussion might now be made after quiet conversations held elsewhere. The shift rarely provoked open confrontation. Many wives recognized the change but understood that confronting it publicly would damage the very structure they were expected to protect. Maintaining dignity often required silence, even when that silence confirmed the distance growing inside the marriage. Society itself encouraged this quiet acceptance. As long as the marriage continued to exist in its proper form, few people questioned what occurred beyond the visible ceremonies of household life. The law concerned itself with property and legitimacy, not emotional loyalty. This allowed influence to move freely through private spaces. A mistress could shape a man's thoughts without ever appearing in the official narrative of the household. Her presence might guide decisions, calm frustrations, or strengthen certain loyalties while weakening others. The wife remained the foundation of the household's legitimacy, but legitimacy and influence were no longer perfectly aligned. And in many cases, the person who held a man's attention during quiet moments held more practical influence than the person who shared his name in public records. The wife remained present within the household, holding the position that law and tradition had given her. Yet the attention of her husband had begun to settle elsewhere, where conversation felt easier, and listening required no ceremony. When attention quietly moves away from position and toward presence, the balance of influence inside a household may begin to change long before anyone openly admits it. In many noble households, influence rarely changed through dramatic moments. There were no sudden declarations that altered the structure of the marriage. No public acknowledgements that another woman had become important. Instead, the change appeared through something far quieter. Routine. Daily life in a noble residence followed carefully repeated patterns. Morning discussions about estate matters. Meals taken at specific hours. Visitors received in drawing rooms. And arranged for polite conversation. These rhythms created the impression that the household moved forward with calm stability. Yet habits also determined where attention settled. At first, the mistress might only appear during occasional visits or gatherings. She might speak with the husband briefly during dinner, or exchange a few words while other guests filled the room with conversation. These interactions seemed harmless and easily overlooked. Over time, however, the encounters began to repeat themselves. The husband might notice that he looked forward to speaking with her again. Conversations that had once lasted a few minutes gradually stretched longer. A shared moment in the garden might extend into an evening discussion beside a window overlooking the estate. None of these meetings needed to be secret. They simply became frequent. Frequency is a powerful force in human relationships. When someone appears regularly in the quiet spaces of daily life, familiarity begins to grow. The person becomes part of the landscape of routine, much like a familiar chair in the study or the sound of servants preparing the evening meal. The mistress gradually entered that landscape. She might be present during small, seemingly insignificant moments. A conversation while the husband reviewed letters from tenants. A brief discussion during a walk through the grounds. A quiet exchange in the drawing room after guests had departed. And the house finally settled into evening silence. These moments carried a subtle importance. Unlike formal discussions between husband and wife, which often revolved around household duties or family expectations, conversations with the mistress could drift freely between topics. The husband might speak about frustrations that had accumulated during the day or about decisions that required careful thought. She listened. Listening may appear passive, yet in private relationships, it becomes a powerful form of presence. A person who listens consistently begins to occupy a special place in another's routine. The act itself creates a sense of being understood, even if little advice is offered in return. Over time, the husband might begin to speak with her about matters that once remained confined to his own thoughts. These were rarely grand political decisions or major changes to the estate. Instead, they were the countless small choices that shaped daily life. Questions about which servant could be trusted with a delicate responsibility. Thoughts about how to respond to a difficult relative. Uncertainties about managing a dispute between tenants. Each conversation seemed minor, yet together they created a pattern. The mistress became the person present during the moments when the husband paused to consider his options. Her presence accompanied the quiet spaces between larger responsibilities. When letters arrived or problems emerged, she might be the first person he spoke to before any formal action was taken. Gradually, this presence began to feel natural. The wife still held her rightful position within the household. She remained responsible for its order, its ceremonies, and its public dignity. Her authority over servants and domestic management continued unchanged. But the rhythm of private conversation had shifted. Where the wife's role required structure and oversight, the mistress occupied the informal spaces where reflection occurred. She appeared not as a rival within the household hierarchy, but as a constant presence within the husband's personal routine. Repetition strengthened that role. Days passed in which the husband spoke with her several times, often without planning to do so. A remark made in passing could turn into a longer discussion. A simple question could open a conversation that lasted until the candles burned low. These repeated encounters built familiarity. Familiarity, in turn, created dependence. A moment might arrive when the husband notices her absence more sharply than before. A room that once felt comfortable now seemed strangely quiet when she was not there. Decisions that once felt easy suddenly required more thought without the brief exchanges that had become part of his routine. The change had occurred gradually enough that few people recognized it. The marriage remained untouched in its official form. The wife continued to appear in every place society expected her to be. The household maintained its order, its reputation, and its carefully managed dignity. Yet daily presence had begun to shift. And when one person becomes the steady listener in another's life, even the smallest conversations can quietly reshape where influence begins to settle. A mistress often gained influence not through dramatic actions, but through quiet repetition within the routines of daily life. Her constant presence during small conversations allowed her to become the person who listened most often and most closely. Over time, a person who appears in nearly every private moment of reflection can slowly turn from a simple habit into someone whose absence begins to feel difficult to ignore. Daily life inside a noble marriage often moved according to obligation rather than feeling. Husband and wife performed the roles expected of them with quiet discipline. Their responsibilities were clear, their duties familiar, and their positions firmly defined by law. Family expectation and tradition. Everything appeared stable. Yet stability did not always provide emotional warmth. Within the structure of marriage, the wife carried responsibilities that shaped how she interacted with her husband. She represented the order of the household, the dignity of the family, and the future of the lineage through children. Every action she took reflected upon the reputation of the family itself. Because of this, her behavior was expected to remain controlled and measured. Too much emotional intensity might appear improper. Too much admiration might seem insincere. Even affection could be tempered by the quiet discipline required of a noble wife. Her role demanded steadiness rather than emotional display. Over time, this expectation influenced how husband and wife spoke to each other. Conversations between them often remained practical. Estate matters, family concerns, religious observances, and preparations for guests filled much of their discussion. These topics were necessary and respectable, yet they rarely touched the deeper frustrations or insecurities that individuals carried within themselves. The husband rarely appeared as a vulnerable person within these exchanges. Instead, he existed primarily as a figure of authority. Servants obeyed him. Tenants relied on his decisions. His wife respected his role as the head of the household. This position reinforced dignity, but it also created distance. Authority leaves little space for vulnerability. A mistress, however, existed outside that formal structure. She did not carry the same obligations toward household order or family reputation. Her position within the relationship remained unofficial, which allowed her behavior to feel less restricted by expectations. She did not need to maintain the careful balance of dignity that defined a noble wife's conduct. This freedom changed the tone of the conversation. Where the wife often responded with calm practicality, the mistress might respond with sympathy. When the husband described frustrations with estate disputes or political rivalries, she could express concern without needing to preserve the formal image of the household. Her reactions felt more personal. The difference was subtle but powerful. Sympathy does not require authority. It requires attention. A mistress could listen closely and respond with emotional understanding rather than responsibility. She could acknowledge the husband's frustrations without immediately turning the conversation toward duty or reputation. For a man accustomed to carrying constant responsibility, this kind of response could feel deeply comforting. There was another emotional element that distinguished the mistress from the wife: admiration. Within marriage, admiration often faded into familiarity. Husband and wife knew each other's routines, habits, and limitations. Years of shared household management replaced the early curiosity that might have existed at the beginning of their union. The mistress encountered the husband differently. She saw him not as a permanent structure within the household, but as an individual whose actions could still inspire admiration. A decision that appeared routine to the wife might seem impressive to someone observing from outside the marriage. Expressions of admiration could appear simple: a remark about his intelligence, a quiet compliment about how he handled a difficult situation, a moment of visible respect when he spoke about matters of responsibility. These gestures reinforced a sense of personal value, admiration, especially when expressed gently and consistently, creates a powerful emotional atmosphere. It reminds a person that they are not only fulfilling obligations, but also being recognized for who they are. In contrast, long marriages often replace admiration with familiarity. Familiarity is comfortable, yet it rarely produces excitement. Duties replace curiosity. Predictable routines replace discovery. Even affection can begin to feel like another responsibility rather than a spontaneous emotion. The mistress existed outside this pattern. Her presence preserved a certain distance that allowed curiosity to remain alive. Conversations could feel new. Reactions could feel spontaneous. The relationship did not carry the weight of shared domestic responsibility. This difference sustained something that structured marriages often lost: desire. Desire thrives in spaces where obligation is absent. Within marriage, many interactions became tied to duty: managing the household, raising children, and maintaining social reputation. These responsibilities shaped how husband and wife perceived each other. The mistress, however, represented a relationship untouched by those demands. Her presence suggested choice rather than obligation. Time spent with her did not arise from duty, but from personal inclination. This distinction made each meeting feel deliberate rather than routine. Gradually, the emotional atmosphere surrounding the mistress became distinct from the atmosphere of marriage. With the wife came structure, continuity, and legitimacy. With the mistress came attention, admiration, and the quiet excitement of personal connection. Both roles existed simultaneously within many noble households. Yet emotional attention rarely divides itself evenly. And in relationships where admiration and empathy remain alive, those qualities often become more powerful than the responsibilities that define a lawful marriage. Within marriage, emotional expression was often restrained by duty, reputation, and the responsibilities attached to legitimacy. A mistress, free from those expectations, could offer sympathy, admiration, and a sense of personal attention that felt rare within structured relationships. Gradually, emotional warmth that appeared effortless beside obligation may begin to draw attention in ways that quiet discipline cannot easily compete with. Over time, relationships within noble households were rarely transformed by sudden decisions. Influence did not usually appear in dramatic gestures or public declarations. Instead, it developed through repetition, through moments that seemed ordinary when viewed individually, but slowly formed a pattern across days and weeks. Habit often carried more power than intention. Within the quiet rhythm of daily life, conversations between the husband and the mistress began to occur with increasing regularity. At first, these exchanges appeared casual and unplanned. A brief discussion during an afternoon walk through the gardens. A few minutes spent speaking beside a window after dinner while the household settled into evening silence. Yet the same moments returned again and again. Repetition gradually created familiarity. The husband began to expect these conversations as part of his daily routine. They did not need to be arranged or formally acknowledged. Their existence became natural, almost automatic, like the lighting of candles at dusk or the sound of servants preparing the morning meal. Each day contained small opportunities for conversation. The mistress might appear while the husband reviewed letters delivered from distant estates. She might pass through a room where he had paused to consider a financial report. A question asked in passing could turn into a discussion that lasted far longer than either of them had intended. Nothing about these interactions appeared extraordinary. They simply happened often enough to become predictable. Predictability, however, slowly deepened emotional attachment. When two people speak frequently, they begin to learn the rhythms of each other's thoughts. The husband might anticipate her reactions to certain topics. The mistress might recognize the tone of his voice when frustration or uncertainty began to surface. This quiet understanding strengthened the connection between them. The wife, meanwhile, remained occupied with the responsibilities that defined her position. Her days were filled with supervising servants, organizing household logistics, and maintaining the dignity expected of the lady of the estate. These tasks required constant attention and left little room for spontaneous conversation. The difference was subtle but significant. Where the wife's presence was structured by duty, the mistress's presence revolved around conversation. Another element deepened the sense of connection between them. Letters. In a noble society, written correspondence formed an important part of communication. Messengers carried letters between estates, towns, and courts. These messages often concerned estate management, financial agreements, or family matters that required careful documentation. Yet private letters could serve a different purpose. A mistress might send a brief note reflecting on a conversation they had shared the previous evening. The husband might respond with a letter describing frustrations that he had not spoken aloud within the formal setting of the household. These exchanges created a quiet rhythm between them. Words written in private often carried a tone different from spoken conversation. Without the presence of servants or family members nearby, thoughts could be expressed more freely. A sentence written late at night might contain honesty that never appeared during daylight hours. Letters preserved attention. Even when the mistress was not physically present, her words remained with the husband. A folded page placed inside a desk drawer could be reread during moments of uncertainty. Her voice continued to exist through ink and paper long after the messenger had delivered the letter. Gradually, these letters reinforced the habit of emotional connection. Days began to feel incomplete without some form of communication between them. A conversation during the afternoon might be followed by a short message delivered the next morning. The rhythm of contact continued almost effortlessly. Habit had quietly formed. Habits influence perception in ways that often go unnoticed. When a person becomes part of another's daily routine, their absence begins to feel unusually noticeable. The husband might move through familiar rooms, expecting to see the mistress appear as she had the day before. If she did not appear, the difference felt immediate. A drawing room once filled with conversation now seemed strangely quiet. A garden path where discussions had taken place felt empty. Even the act of reviewing letters might feel incomplete, without the expectation of sharing a thought with her afterward. The absence revealed the depth of the habit. The marriage itself remained unchanged. The wife continued to hold the position of authority within the household. Her responsibilities and dignity remained intact, recognized by every servant and visitor who entered the estate. But habit had shifted the emotional landscape. The mistress had become woven into the husband's daily experience through repeated conversations, private letters, and familiar moments of attention. Her presence no longer appeared occasional. It had become expected, and when expectation settles quietly into routine, the line between companionship and dependence begins to fade. Repeated conversations and private letters slowly transformed casual interaction into a familiar rhythm within daily life. The mistress became a constant presence in moments of reflection, gradually weaving herself into the habits that shaped the husband's routine. Eventually, the quiet absence of someone who once appeared every day can reveal how deeply habit has begun to resemble necessity. In many noble households, influence rarely depended on titles alone. A name written in family records might establish authority. Yet the rhythms of daily life often revealed a quieter truth. Presence, repeated often enough, could become more powerful than position itself. At first, the mistress remained only a presence among many within the household. Noble residences were filled with movement. Visitors arrived without warning. Relatives stayed for extended periods, and servants carried messages between rooms at all hours of the day. In such an environment, a single individual could easily appear ordinary. Yet familiarity gradually changed the meaning of that presence. The mistress might begin appearing regularly during moments that once belonged to no one in particular. She might enter the drawing room during the quiet hour before dinner, She might cross the gardens at the same time each afternoon, when her husband took his walk to clear his thoughts after reviewing estate matters. The timing slowly became predictable. Predictability carries a quiet emotional weight. When a person appears at the same time each day, the mind begins to anticipate their arrival without conscious effort. The husband might find himself glancing toward the doorway at a certain hour, expecting to see her enter with the same calm expression she carried the day before. No announcement was necessary. The household itself continued moving according to its familiar routines. Servants prepared meals. Fires were lit as evening approached, and distant voices drifted through corridors as guests moved from one room to another. Amid this ordinary activity, her presence began to feel natural. She did not need a formal invitation to speak with the husband. The space between them had already been established through repetition. A chair drawn slightly closer to the table, a quiet remark made while he reviewed letters, or a brief exchange during an evening gathering could easily grow into a longer conversation. No title authorized these moments. They existed simply because they had occurred so many times before. The wife, by contrast, remained bound to the expectations of her role. Her movements within the household followed patterns of responsibility. She oversaw servants, received guests, and ensured that the routines of the estate continued without disruption. Her presence carried authority, but authority often required distance. A noble wife rarely entered a room casually or without purpose. Her actions were observed by servants and visitors alike. Even the tone of her voice reflected the dignity expected from her position. These expectations preserved order, yet they also limited spontaneity. The mistress existed outside those constraints. Because she held no official responsibility within the household, her presence could appear lighter. She could enter a conversation without ceremony, speak without calculating how each word might affect the household's reputation, and leave without explanation. Gradually, this freedom made her presence feel effortless. The husband might begin to associate certain parts of the day with her arrival. A discussion that once felt routine suddenly carried interest because he expected her reaction. Even small matters could feel more engaging when shared with someone whose presence had become familiar. In this way, habit slowly reshaped perception. The mistress did not replace the wife's authority. The household still recognized the lawful marriage as its foundation. Guests continued to treat the wife with respect, and servants still followed her instructions. Yet the emotional rhythm of daily life had shifted. The husband might notice that certain rooms felt quieter when she was absent. A conversation begun in her presence might seem incomplete when she left. These sensations rarely appeared dramatic, yet they revealed how deeply routine had begun to influence his attention. Habit can grow powerful precisely because it feels ordinary. A person who appears consistently within the quiet spaces of daily life becomes part of the environment itself. Their presence blends into the background of routine until it becomes difficult to imagine the same routine without them. The mistress gradually occupied that place. She did not claim the household's authority or its formal position. Her role existed entirely within the subtle territory of familiarity. Conversations, shared glances, and repeated encounters created a quiet expectation that shaped the husband's daily experience. And expectations rarely disappear easily once they have formed. The mistress did not gain influence through titles or public recognition, but through a steady presence within the small routines of everyday life. Repeated encounters transformed casual meetings into a quiet expectation that shaped the rhythm of the husband's days. Eventually, someone who appears often enough within private moments may begin to feel less like a visitor and more like a presence. The household quietly grows accustomed to needing. Influence inside noble households rarely announced itself openly. Decisions were officially made by the husband, supported by advisors, lawyers, and relatives whose positions were recognized by law and tradition. Authority appeared clear, structured, and firmly rooted in hierarchy. Yet influence did not always travel through official channels. In many cases, it moved quietly through proximity. The mistress, unlike advisors or household officers, I held no recognized position within the structure of power. She signed no documents, attended no councils, and issued no commands to servants or tenants. In every formal sense, she possessed no authority at all. Yet her closeness to the husband allowed her to participate in something far more subtle. Conversation. The difference between command and suggestion can appear small, yet it shapes how influence develops. Advisors often spoke with the weight of responsibility behind their words. Their opinions were expected to be firm and practical. Lawyers recommended legal solutions. Relatives argued for the interests of their own families. The mistress spoke differently. Her comments rarely appeared as instructions. Instead, they emerged naturally within conversation. A question was asked during an evening walk. A brief reflection was offered while the husband reviewed letters at his desk. A quiet remark was shared after hearing him describe a problem that had troubled him throughout the day. These remarks carried no authority, yet they entered the husband's thinking at a moment when his mind was already searching for direction. A suggestion delivered in such circumstances often felt less like advice and more like shared reflection. The husband did not feel ordered or pressured. Instead, he felt understood. Understanding can be persuasive. The mistress might respond to a story about a difficult tenant by asking a simple question about the man's character. She might observe that a certain servant seemed unusually loyal or unusually careless. Her comments did not require action, yet they planted ideas that remained in the husband's thoughts long after the conversation ended. Over time, these small exchanges began to influence how he viewed certain situations. The husband might reconsider a decision after recalling something she had said casually the evening before. A remark that seemed minor at the time might return to his mind when he sat alone reviewing estate accounts or preparing for a meeting with other landowners. This process rarely appeared deliberate. The mistress did not position herself as an advisor. She offered observations rather than conclusions. Her tone remained thoughtful rather than authoritative. Because of this, her influence felt natural rather than strategic. Gradually, however, a pattern emerged. Before finalizing certain decisions, the husband might find himself discussing them with her first. Not because he needed permission or formal guidance, but because conversation with her had become part of how he organized his thoughts. The discussion might take place during a quiet moment in the gardens or beside a fire late in the evening when the household had grown still. These moments served as a kind of private reflection. Speaking aloud allowed the husband to examine ideas before presenting them to advisors or relatives. The mistress listened carefully and responded with questions or gentle observations. Her presence created a space where thoughts could be tested without the pressure of official expectations. In this way, she became an informal point of reference. The wife remained the center of household authority. Her responsibilities continued to shape the structure of daily life within the estate. She supervised servants, maintained order, and ensured that the reputation of the household remained secure. Yet the wife's role rarely involved these quiet discussions of uncertainty. Her position required decisiveness and stability. She represented the order of the household rather than the uncertainty that often accompanied difficult decisions. The mistress, by contrast, existed within the quieter space of personal conversation. Here, influence developed not through command, but through closeness, the ability to listen, to respond thoughtfully, and to remain present during moments of reflection allowed her voice to enter the husband's thinking without ever appearing to challenge his authority. Such influence was almost invisible. Servants did not see it. Guests did not hear it. Even the husband himself might not fully recognize how often her observations shaped the way he approached certain choices. The marriage remained publicly intact. The structure of the household continued exactly as society expected. Yet within the private moments where ideas formed and decisions began to take shape, the presence of the mistress quietly altered the path those decisions might follow. The mistress rarely commanded authority within the household. Yet her closeness allowed her words to enter conversations where decisions first began to form. Through questions, reflections, and quiet observations, she gradually became part of the husband's private process of thinking. In time, the person who listens during moments of uncertainty can begin to influence choices long before those choices ever appear in the open world. Influence inside noble households rarely belonged to a single individual alone. Even when a mistress appeared to act quietly on her own, her presence was often supported by a small network of people whose roles seemed insignificant at first glance. These individuals rarely appeared in records or public discussions, yet their movements and conversations carried information through the private spaces of the household. In large residences, servants formed the invisible structure that allowed daily life to function. Footmen carried messages between rooms, maids moved silently through corridors, and attendants remained close to their employers throughout the day. Their duties required them to observe the household constantly, even if they spoke very little about what they saw. Because of this, they often knew more than anyone else. A mistress who spent time within such a household quickly learned how valuable these quiet observers could become. Friendship with a lady's companion, or kindness toward a trusted maid, created small bridges of communication that extended far beyond a single conversation. A maid who felt respected might mention when the husband appeared troubled after meeting with certain advisors. A servant carrying letters might quietly remark on which messages arrived most frequently from distant relatives. None of these details appeared important on their own, yet together they formed a subtle flow of information. Another important figure within this network was the messenger or letter carrier. In an age when written correspondence travelled slowly between estates, the people responsible for delivering letters often understood the rhythm of communication between households. They recognized familiar seals, handwriting, and patterns of urgency long before the letters were opened. A mistress who maintained a friendly relationship with such individuals could gain small but valuable insights. A messenger might casually note that several letters had arrived from a particular noble family within the same week. This observation might suggest negotiations taking place behind closed doors. A brief comment about a delayed reply could reveal hesitation or disagreement among advisors. These fragments of knowledge rarely appeared significant, but they helped the mistress understand the atmosphere surrounding the husband's decisions before those decisions were publicly announced. Friends also played an important role within this quiet network. Noble women often maintained close relationships with companions who visited frequently or corresponded through letters. Conversations between such friends moved easily between personal matters and the subtle politics of social life. Through these discussions, rumors and observations circulated quietly. A friend might mention that a certain advisor had recently fallen out of favor at court. Another might remark that a neighboring family appeared eager to strengthen their alliance through marriage. These pieces of information carried no official authority, yet they shaped how events were interpreted. The mistress absorbed these details gradually. She did not control the network directly. Instead, she listened carefully as fragments of information reached her through different channels. A servant's remark, a friend's observation, or a messenger's casual comment could each reveal a small piece of the larger picture surrounding the household. Information gained this way often appeared incomplete, yet partial knowledge can still influence perception. By hearing about events before they fully unfolded, the mistress could adjust her conversations with the husband accordingly. She might ask questions about a particular advisor or express curiosity about a decision that seemed likely to arise. These questions often appeared innocent. The husband might interpret them simply as an interest in his affairs. He might respond by explaining details he had not intended to share with anyone else. In doing so, he unknowingly strengthened the flow of information between them. This process allowed influence to travel quietly through personal relationships rather than official authority. The wife, despite her legitimate position within the household, rarely relied on such networks. Her authority rested on formal structure. Servants answered to her directly, and her responsibilities centered on maintaining order rather than gathering subtle information. The mistress operated differently. Without formal authority, she depended on relationships instead of hierarchy. Friendship, curiosity, and kindness opened paths through which information could move freely. Each small conversation strengthened connections that extended beyond the immediate household. Gradually, these connections formed an invisible web of awareness. The mistress understood who moved through the household, who carried letters between estates, and who observed the quiet tensions that existed behind polite conversation. None of these individuals recognized themselves as part of a network, yet together they created one. Through this web of small relationships, the mistress gained a quiet awareness of events long before they became visible to the wider household. Her influence did not arise from commands or official decisions. It emerged from knowing where information flowed and listening carefully as it passed through the hands of ordinary people. Behind the quiet presence of a mistress often stood a network of servants, friends, and messengers who carried fragments of information through the household. These small observations allowed her to understand the atmosphere surrounding decisions long before they became public knowledge. Within households where influence moved through conversation rather than authority, the person who hears the earliest whispers may quietly understand more than anyone expects. Power inside noble households did not always move through open conflict. The structure of marriage, property, and inheritance remained firmly protected by law and tradition. Anyone who attempted to challenge that structure directly risked social ruin. A mistress who openly confronted a lawful wife would not only lose favor, but might also destroy the delicate balance that allowed her presence to exist within the household. Because of this, confrontation rarely occurred. The mistress understood that the wife held a position supported by family alliances, legal recognition, and religious authority. Removing such a position through force or public scandal would invite consequences far beyond the walls of the estate. Reputation mattered deeply within noble society, and any open conflict could quickly become a matter discussed in courts, churches, and neighboring households. Subtlety, therefore, became essential. Rather than challenging the wife's authority, the mistress often avoided competing with it altogether. She did not attempt to take the wife's seat at formal dinners or claim the responsibilities of household management. The structure of marriage remained untouched, at least in appearance. Her influence developed elsewhere. The difference between visible authority and emotional influence created a space where softer strategies could operate quietly. The wife maintained order within the household, while the mistress focused on shaping the atmosphere surrounding the husband's thoughts and feelings. This distinction allowed both roles to exist without immediate confrontation. Softness, in this context, was not weakness. It functioned as a form of careful restraint. The mistress rarely demanded dramatic change. She did not insist that the husband abandon his marriage or alter the public arrangement of the household. Such demands would have created resistance and drawn unwanted attention. Instead, she allowed the relationship to remain undefined. The husband continued fulfilling his responsibilities toward his wife and family. Public ceremonies, religious observances, and social gatherings preserved the appearance of stability. From the outside, the marriage seemed unchanged. Yet within private conversations, emotional influence gradually deepened. The mistress might respond gently when the husband spoke about tensions within the household. She might express sympathy without criticizing the wife directly. Her tone remained thoughtful rather than confrontational, allowing the husband to reach his own conclusions about the situation he described. This approach carried a quiet advantage. When criticism appears direct, people instinctively defend themselves or those connected to them. A husband confronted with accusations against his wife might feel obligated to protect the legitimacy of his marriage. Direct pressure could therefore strengthen the very structure the mistress might wish to weaken. Soft influence avoided this reaction. Instead of attacking the wife's position, the mistress allowed the husband to interpret his experiences independently. If he described frustration with household routines or emotional distance within the marriage, she simply listened and acknowledged his feelings. Her responses often appeared sympathetic rather than persuasive. Over time, this created a powerful emotional contrast. The wife remained associated with responsibility, discipline, and the careful maintenance of social order. Her role required firmness and stability. The mistress, by contrast, became associated with understanding and emotional comfort. The difference shaped how the husband perceived each relationship. Human attention naturally moves toward environments where tension feels lower and understanding appears easier. A person who consistently provides calm reassurance becomes a refuge from responsibilities that feel heavy or exhausting. The mistress quietly occupied that position. She did not demand legal recognition or social authority. Her influence depended entirely on emotional presence. The husband could speak freely without worrying that his words might alter the delicate structure of the household. This freedom allowed conversations to explore frustrations that remained hidden elsewhere. Emotional influence often travels more easily than legal authority. Law governs property and status, but emotions guide daily decisions. A husband may respect the legal structure of his marriage while still turning towards someone else for understanding and encouragement. The mistress recognized that this emotional territory offered opportunities unavailable through formal channels. Gradually, her presence shaped the atmosphere surrounding the husband's private reflections. Small remarks offered during quiet conversations could alter how he interpreted events within the household. Sympathy expressed at the right moment could strengthen his sense of connection to her. None of these actions required confrontation or public recognition. The structure of marriage remained untouched. Yet emotional influence continued to grow beneath that structure. Softness, therefore, became a deliberate strategy. By avoiding direct conflict and allowing the household's formal hierarchy to remain intact, the mistress protected her own position while expanding the quiet territory where her presence mattered most. The mistress rarely challenged the wife's authority openly, recognizing that the structure of marriage was too powerful to confront directly. Instead, her influence developed through patience, sympathy, and emotional understanding that avoided public conflict. Gradually, influence rooted in feeling rather than law may begin to reshape loyalty without ever disturbing the visible order of the household. Authority within noble households appeared to follow clear and recognizable rules. Titles were carefully recorded in documents. Wax seals confirmed legitimacy, and signatures carried the force of law across estates and courts. Every major decision seemed to pass through this visible structure of hierarchy. From a distance, the system looked orderly and complete. Yet the true beginnings of many decisions rarely appeared in documents. Before a seal was pressed or a letter was sent, choices often formed quietly in moments that carried no official significance. A man responsible for land, finance, and family alliances could not decide everything instantly. He spent long periods thinking through possibilities, weighing risks that others might never fully see. These reflections rarely happened in public spaces. They occurred during quieter hours of the day. A walk through the gardens after reading a troubling letter. A pause beside a window overlooking the estate fields. A conversation was held late in the evening, while the rest of the household slowly drifted towards sleep. In these moments, decisions remained unfinished. Thoughts moved freely between doubt and certainty. A husband might speak aloud about a dispute with neighbouring landowners, or question whether a certain advisor had begun acting in his own interest rather than the household's. Such conversations often began casually. The husband might simply describe the situation without expecting a solution. Speaking allowed him to hear his own reasoning more clearly. The act of explaining an uncertainty could reveal weaknesses in an argument or strengthen a conclusion already forming in his mind. Within these conversations, the mistress often occupied a quiet position. She possessed no legal voice in the affairs of the household. No counsel recognized her presence. No contract required her opinion to be considered. In the official structure of authority, she did not exist, yet she listened carefully. Listening placed her at the earliest stage of the decision-making process. She heard the husband's thoughts before they hardened into final judgments. Doubts that might never appear in formal discussions emerged naturally in these private moments. Because she carried no responsibility for the outcome, her responses remained gentle. She rarely attempted to direct the husband's choices openly. Instead, she asked questions or offered reflections that seemed almost casual. A remark about a person's character, a quiet observation about how certain events might affect the household's reputation. None of these responses demanded action, yet they encouraged the husband to reconsider his own reasoning. A question asked at the right moment could linger in his mind long after the conversation ended. A small comment might return to him later, while he reviews letters or prepares to speak with advisors. Gradually, these exchanges became part of the rhythm through which decisions formed. The husband might return to the mistress when uncertainty appeared again, not because she held authority, but because conversation with her allowed his thoughts to settle into clearer shape. Explaining a problem often clarified the path toward resolving it. This gave the mistress an unusual form of presence. She participated in the earliest stage of thought, where ideas remained flexible and open to influence. By the time a decision reached advisors, relatives, or legal representatives, the direction of that decision had often already been quietly determined. The difference between authority and influence became increasingly visible. Authority operates through recognition. It relies on documents, titles, and formal positions that grant the right to command. Influence, by contrast, moves through conversation, shaping ideas before authority ever speaks. The mistress belonged entirely to this second realm. The lawful wife remained the visible center of household legitimacy. Her responsibilities ensured that the estate functioned smoothly and that the family's reputation remained secure. Servants answered to her authority, and visitors recognized her role as the lady of the house. Her influence appeared through structure and order. The mistress operated through something far less visible. Her role existed within the quiet moments where the husband reflected upon his choices before presenting them to the world. She heard uncertainties before they disappeared behind confident decisions. Her presence shaped how those uncertainties were resolved. None of this appeared in the records. Documents still carried the husband's signature alone. Wax seals confirmed his authority as the final decision-maker. Visitors continued to see the household arranged exactly as tradition required. Yet many decisions had already passed through quieter conversations long before the official record began. The mistress did not need recognition to influence them. Her presence existed within the private space where thoughts first took form, long before authority placed its seal upon the outcome. The mistress held no title, seal, or official authority within the household structure. Yet her presence during moments of reflection allowed her voice to accompany the husband's thoughts before decisions were made, where ideas take shape quietly before authority speaks. Influence can travel further than any written signature ever suggests. Within noble households, the position of a wife remained one of the most visible roles in the entire structure of family life. Her presence represented legitimacy, stability, and continuity. Guests arriving at the estate expected to see her seated beside her husband during formal dinners. Servants understood that her authority governed the daily order of the household. Nothing about her position appeared uncertain. Her name appeared in legal records connected to the estate. Property agreements often referred to her dowry or inheritance rights. Children born within the marriage carried the legitimacy that secured the family's future. Religious ceremonies recognized her as the lawful partner whose presence completed the structure of marriage. In every official sense, she remained central to the household. Visitors noticed her calm authority during gatherings. Relatives addressed her with respect. Servants followed her instructions regarding meals, rooms, and the countless small details required to maintain an estate that might contain dozens of residents and workers. The system functioned exactly as tradition intended, yet daily life inside the household could reveal a quieter change. The wife continued to appear in all the places where society expected her presence. She attended religious observances beside her husband, welcomed guests with practiced grace, and represented the dignity of the family during important occasions. Her role during these moments remained unquestioned, but the atmosphere within private spaces had begun to shift. Decisions that once required conversation between husband and wife gradually moved elsewhere. The husband might review letters concerning estate disputes or political alliances without discussing them openly with her. Matters that once passed naturally through marital discussion became topics addressed privately before any formal announcement occurred. This change rarely appeared dramatic. The husband did not necessarily reject the wife's authority within the household. She still oversaw servants and maintained order within the estate. Her responsibilities continued exactly as before. And from the perspective of society, the marriage appeared stable. Yet, the flow of conversation had quietly altered. The wife might notice that certain discussions no longer reached her ears. Letters arrived and were answered without explanation. Decisions appeared already formed, rather than emerging from shared reflection. The husband spoke about outcomes rather than uncertainties. In this way, the wife's presence remained visible, while her participation gradually narrowed. Her authority still shaped the household's public order. Guests continued to see her guiding the rhythm of formal gatherings, ensuring that traditions were followed with proper dignity. To the outside world, she appeared exactly as the lady of the estate should appear. But influence often grows strongest within moments of uncertainty. Those moments now occurred elsewhere. When the husband encountered difficulties or questions that required careful thought, he might turn to someone who listened without the weight of household responsibility attached to the conversation. The mistress, existing outside the formal structure of marriage, offered a space where such reflections could unfold quietly. The difference between these two roles became increasingly clear. The wife represented stability and legitimacy. Her presence confirmed that the household followed the rules of law and tradition. Every ceremony reinforced her position, reminding observers that the structure of marriage remained intact. The mistress represented something less visible, but equally powerful. She participated in the private atmosphere surrounding the husband's thoughts. Conversations held with her often occurred before decisions reached the stage of public recognition. Her presence accompanied the early formation of ideas, rather than their formal declaration. Because of this, the wife sometimes encountered decisions only after they had already taken shape. She might hear about an arrangement with neighbouring landowners once negotiations had nearly concluded. A change among household staff might appear suddenly rather than emerging through shared discussion. Each event seemed small, yet together they revealed a pattern. The wife's position remained secure, but her voice had become quieter within the process that shaped the household's direction. Such changes rarely produced open conflict. Noble society valued the appearance of stability, and both husband and wife understood the importance of maintaining that appearance. The marriage continued to function according to its formal obligations. Yet beneath that surface, attention had shifted. The wife still stood at the center of ceremonies, property records, and family lineage. Her authority over the structure of the household remained visible to everyone who entered the estate. But the quieter space where ideas formed and decisions began had gradually moved beyond her reach. The wife continued to occupy the lawful position at the center of the household's public life. Her authority remained visible in ceremonies, property records, and the daily order of the estate. Yet where conversations about uncertainty quietly began, another presence had already started to replace the place her voice once held. The noble society placed extraordinary importance on appearances. Reputation was not simply a matter of pride, it functioned as a form of social currency. Families maintained their influence through carefully preserved images of order, respectability, and stability. As long as those images remained intact, much of what occurred behind the walls of private households was rarely questioned. The structure of marriage stood at the center of this system. A lawful marriage, connected families, property, and inheritance in ways that extended far beyond the relationship between husband and wife. Estates depended upon legitimate heirs, Alliances between noble houses relied upon marriages that symbolized unity and continuity. Because of this, preserving the visible structure of marriage mattered far more than examining the emotional reality inside it. If the marriage remained publicly intact, society considered the arrangement successful. The husband and wife continued to appear together during ceremonies, religious observances, and gatherings hosted by neighboring families. Their presence side by side reassured observers that the household remained stable and respectable. No open conflict disturbed the order that noble society expected to see. This appearance often satisfied everyone involved. Relatives avoided embarrassment. Alliances remained secure, and the family name continued to carry its usual authority. Guests attending dinners or celebrations saw nothing unusual in the arrangement. Servants moved quietly through rooms where conversations flowed politely between individuals who had learned to perform their roles with practiced ease. Behind this public order, however, personal relationships often followed more complicated paths. The presence of a mistress rarely remained entirely hidden. Servants noticed patterns of conversation. Visitors observed familiar interactions, and whispers occasionally passed through social circles that thrived on quiet speculation. Yet these observations rarely produced open confrontation. Most people simply chose not to speak about what they already understood. Silence served an important purpose. Acknowledging private relationships would force society to address the tension between moral ideals and everyday reality. Noble families preferred to avoid such discomfort. As long as the structure of marriage remained visible, the existence of other relationships could be quietly ignored. This quiet tolerance allowed many households to continue functioning without scandal. The wife maintained her legitimate position. Her authority over the household remained publicly recognized, and her dignity protected the reputation of the family. Servants followed her instructions, and guests addressed her with the respect required by her role. Nothing about her status appeared threatened. The husband fulfilled his responsibilities as the head of the household. He attended gatherings, managed estate affairs, and represented his family in the wider world of noble politics. His marriage continued to symbolize stability, even if its emotional foundation had shifted over time. The mistress occupied a space that existed entirely outside formal recognition. She did not appear beside the husband during ceremonies or sign documents connected to the estate. Her presence remained confined to the quieter areas of daily life, where official rules rarely reached. Because her influence avoided public display, society found it easier to overlook. Many observers understood the arrangement without discussing it openly. A relative visiting the estate might notice the familiarity between the husband and the mistress, but choose to remain silent out of respect for the household's reputation. Friends might exchange discreet glances, yet avoid direct conversation about what they had seen. This silence preserved the illusion that nothing had changed. The system relied upon this illusion. As long as the marriage remained visible and the wife's dignity was not publicly challenged, the broader social order remained secure. The noble society valued stability above moral consistency. A scandal that threatened family alliances carried far greater consequences than a private relationship that remained discreet. The result was a quiet agreement shared by everyone involved. The wife maintained her public authority. The husband preserved his reputation. The mistress continued her private presence. Observers noticed the arrangement, but rarely acknowledged it directly. Such arrangements could persist for years. Each person understood the boundaries that protected the household's reputation. Public ceremonies reinforced the image of unity, while private conversations unfolded in spaces carefully removed from formal observation. Society accepted this balance because it protected the larger structure of noble life. The truth remained visible to those who looked closely, yet silence ensured that the appearance of order continued without interruption. Noble society placed greater value on preserving the visible structure of marriage than on examining the private relationships that existed within it. As long as the wife's position and the family's reputation remained publicly secure, quiet arrangements inside the household were often ignored. Where appearances satisfy the expectations of society, Silence can become the simplest way to protect a truth that everyone already understands. Life within noble households rarely moved with the calm order that visitors imagined. Behind the polished manners of public gatherings and the steady rhythm of estate management, pressure followed the husband almost constantly. Land disputes, financial obligations, political loyalties, and family expectations formed a weight that few men in such positions could escape. Every letter arriving at the estate might contain new uncertainty. A neighbouring landowner might question property boundaries. A relative could request financial support that strained the estate's resources. Political shifts might demand alliances that carried risks no one could predict with certainty. The husband faced these pressures alone more often than observers realized. His lawful wife occupied an important place within the structure of the household, but her responsibilities focused largely on stability. She oversaw servants, preserved the dignity of the estate, and ensured that daily life followed the traditions expected of a noble family. These duties required discipline and consistency. Because of this, conversations between husband and wife often centered on practical matters. The organization of the household, the arrangements for visiting relatives, or the preparation for ceremonies demanded attention. Their exchanges maintained the order that kept the estate functioning smoothly. Yet emotional strain rarely found relief within these structured interactions. The husband could not always speak openly about doubt or frustration within the framework of formal responsibility. Admitting uncertainty risked undermining the confidence expected from the head of the household. Nobility valued control and composure, especially in public life. For this reason, emotional burdens often seek quieter spaces. The mistress frequently became one of those spaces. Her presence carried no official responsibility. She did not manage servants, negotiate property arrangements, or represent the household before society. Because of this, conversations with her could remain personal rather than practical. The difference was subtle, but important. When the husband spoke with the mistress, he often described the pressures weighing on him without the need to maintain a composed appearance. Frustrations that would remain hidden in formal settings emerged naturally in private conversation. These discussions rarely resembled political negotiations or household planning. They resembled a reflection. The mistress listened closely, while the husband described conflicts that seemed impossible to resolve. Her responses did not attempt to solve the problem directly. Instead, she offered reassurance that softened the tension surrounding the situation. Sometimes, this reassurance appeared in the form of encouragement. A husband returning from a difficult meeting might question whether his judgment had been mistaken. The mistress might remind him of previous decisions that had proven successful, quietly reinforcing the confidence that uncertainty had begun to weaken. At other times, her role involved calming frustration. A dispute with advisors or relatives could leave the husband angry or exhausted. Speaking about these conflicts allowed him to release tension that would otherwise remain trapped behind the careful composure expected from his position. The mistress provided a place where such emotions could exist without consequence. Because she held no official authority, the husband did not fear appearing uncertain in her presence. Her reactions often carried sympathy rather than judgment, allowing the conversation to remain supportive rather than critical. This emotional support gradually became significant. Confidence plays a quiet but powerful role in leadership. A man responsible for large estates and complex alliances must believe in his ability to guide events successfully. Doubt weakens that belief, especially when failures accumulate. The mistress often helped restore that belief. A few thoughtful words spoken during moments of uncertainty could renew the husband's sense of control. Encouragement did not erase the problems facing him, but it reshaped the emotional environment in which he approached them. Because of this, the mistress functioned as a subtle emotional balance within the household. She absorbed the tension that accompanied the husband's responsibilities and returned calm reassurance in its place. These exchanges required no formal recognition, yet they influenced how the husband experienced the burdens attached to his position. The lawful wife preserved the structure of the household. The mistress preserved the emotional atmosphere surrounding the man who governed that structure. This difference remained largely invisible to society. Visitors saw the order maintained by the wife and the authority exercised by the husband. They did not witness the quiet conversations where anxiety softened and confidence returned. Yet these private moments shaped the emotional foundation beneath many decisions. The mistress did not command the household, but she influenced the emotional state of the man who did. The mistress offered a space where tension could soften, and confidence could quietly return. Her presence did not change the structure of the household, yet it shaped the emotional strength of the man responsible for its direction. Once reassurance becomes part of daily conversation, influence can begin to grow in ways few observers ever notice. The structure of noble households was designed to make authority visible. Titles confirmed legitimacy. Inheritance laws secured family wealth, and ceremonies reinforced the place of every person within the social order. A wife stood at the center of that structure, representing the lawful stability that held estates and alliances together. Her position was clear to everyone who entered the household, but visitors addressed her with formal respect. Servants followed her instructions without hesitation. Documents connected to property, inheritance, and family agreements often included her name as part of the legal framework, protecting the estate's continuity. This visibility carried enormous importance. Through her position, the household appeared ordered and secure. The wife symbolized continuity between generations, ensuring that land, titles, and lineage passed forward without dispute. The noble society depended heavily upon such stability. Yet visibility did not always mean closeness. The responsibilities attached to the wife's role often created distance rather than intimacy. Her duties demanded discipline, organization, and constant awareness of how the household appeared to outsiders. The estate's reputation depended upon her ability to maintain this careful balance. Daily interactions between husband and wife often followed established patterns. Their conversations focused on matters connected to the estate's operation. Guests arriving for dinner, repairs needed in certain buildings, and arrangements for relatives visiting during the winter months. These discussions maintained the structure of the household, but rarely explored the uncertainties or emotional struggles shaping the husband's private thoughts. Gradually, a quiet separation could develop. The wife remained physically present within the household, yet the husband's inner life began unfolding elsewhere. The mistress, existing outside the rigid expectations attached to formal roles, occupied a different kind of space. Her presence carried fewer obligations. She did not represent the estate before visitors or supervise servants responsible for maintaining order. Without these responsibilities, her conversations with her husband could remain personal rather than administrative. This difference created an atmosphere that felt lighter. When the husband spoke with the mistress, the exchange rarely centered on duty or obligation. Instead, conversation moved naturally between reflection, curiosity, and shared observation. These interactions did not require the careful restraint demanded by formal relationships. Closeness grew quietly through repetition. The husband began sharing thoughts that would never appear in formal discussions. Small frustrations, uncertain ambition, and private doubts emerged naturally in the presence of someone who listened without judgment or expectation. This intimacy required no official recognition. The mistress did not sit beside the husband during ceremonies. She did not sign documents connected to the estate. Her name carried no authority within the legal framework governing noble households. Yet she remained present during moments that shaped the husband's emotional world. That presence gradually became familiar. The husband might seek her company after difficult conversations with advisors. A quiet evening discussion could ease the tension created by political conflicts or financial uncertainty. These exchanges offered a form of companionship that the structured role of marriage sometimes struggled to provide. Closeness rarely announces itself as power. It grows slowly through repeated conversations and shared moments that feel natural rather than strategic. The husband may not immediately recognize how much these interactions shape his sense of comfort and trust. Over time, however, emotional reliance becomes difficult to ignore. The lawful wife continued to hold the position recognized by society. Her authority remained visible within ceremonies, documents, and the everyday management of the estate. Nothing about her official role had changed, but emotional attention had quietly shifted. The husband still respected his wife's place within the household. He understood the importance of her position and the stability it provided. Yet the space where he spoke most freely had gradually moved beyond the boundaries of that formal relationship. This difference rarely produced public conflict. Noble society valued the preservation of appearances above all else. As long as the structure of marriage remained visible and orderly, the deeper dynamics of emotional closeness often passed unnoticed. The wife remained the recognized center of the household. The mistress remained the quiet center of the husband's attention. The contrast between these two forms of presence defined many noble relationships. Even though society rarely acknowledged the difference openly, the wife continued to hold the visible position that society recognized and respected. The mistress held the closeness that grew through quiet conversation and repeated presence. In households where silence separates duty from intimacy, the person who remains closest may shape more than anyone ever expects. Dependence rarely begins with authority. It begins with habit. Within noble households, emotional reliance often formed quietly long before anyone recognized its consequences. A man responsible for land, alliance, and reputation might initially seek only comfort in conversation, a place where the burdens of responsibility felt lighter for a moment. The mistress often became that place. At first, the exchanges seemed harmless. The husband described frustrations that had accumulated during the day. Perhaps a steward had mishandled an account, or a relative had demanded support that strained the estate's resources. These concerns did not yet require decisions. They simply required someone willing to listen. The mistress listened with patience. Because she held no formal responsibility for the estate, she could respond without the caution required in official discussions. Her reactions often appeared sympathetic rather than analytical. She offered encouragement when the husband felt uncertain, and calm reassurance when anger threatened to cloud his judgment. Gradually, the conversations began to change. A man who repeatedly speaks about his concerns eventually reaches the point where reflection leads toward action. What begins as emotional release slowly turns into the early stages of decision-making. This shift rarely occurs suddenly. One evening, the husband might mention that a steward seems unreliable. The next time the topic arises, the mistress might quietly observe that certain servants appear more capable than others. Her remark is not presented as advice. It arrives simply as an observation shared in conversation. Yet the observation remains in the husband's thoughts. Days later, while reviewing accounts, he remembers the remark and considers the possibility that another steward might serve the household more effectively. A decision that appears practical may have begun earlier in a quiet exchange that carried no official intention. Small suggestions often grow in this way. The mistress rarely commanded changes directly. Her influence appeared through questions, reflections, and impressions that shaped how the husband interpreted the people around him. When he spoke about members of the household, she listened closely. A servant described as loyal might receive a warmer response when the mistress later encountered that individual in conversation. A relative portrayed as troublesome might receive polite distance rather than enthusiasm. These small reactions gradually influence the husband's perception. Human judgment rarely develops in isolation. Opinions about others often form through repeated conversation, where impressions gather strength through familiarity. When the husband described individuals connected to the estate, the mistress became part of the environment in which those impressions matured. Over time, this environment affected real decisions. The husband might consult his advisors about replacing a steward or assigning new responsibilities among servants. Yet the emotional tone guiding those discussions had already been shaped by earlier conversations. The mistress did not announce her influence. Her presence simply accompanied the husband's thoughts long enough for her impressions to blend with his own reasoning. This dynamic extended beyond household personnel. Financial decisions also carried moments of uncertainty that emerged during private reflection. The husband might consider whether to support a distant relative facing hardship, or whether to invest additional resources into repairing certain parts of the estate. These matters appeared practical. Yet emotion always played a role. A remark from the mistress about generosity toward family members might encourage a more sympathetic decision. A quiet concern about financial strain might reinforce caution during uncertain times. Again, the mistress did not issue instructions. Her influence appeared through the atmosphere surrounding the husband's thinking. Because she participated in the earliest stages of reflection, her presence shaped how possibilities were evaluated before they reached the stage of formal decision. The lawful wife continued to oversee the structure of the household. Her authority ensured that servants fulfilled their duties and that the estate maintained the order expected by noble society. Guests saw her directing the rhythm of daily life with steady confidence. Yet the emotional process guiding many decisions unfolded elsewhere. The mistress remained present during moments when the husband questioned his own judgment. She witnessed the uncertainty that accompanied difficult choices and offered reassurance that softened hesitation. From this reassurance grew confidence. Confidence, in turn, encouraged action. Thus, emotional reliance slowly expanded into practical influence. What began as comfort gradually became participation in the process through which decisions were formed. The mistress never replaced the husband's authority. His signature still confirmed every agreement. His voice delivered every command that shaped the household's future. To observers, the structure of power remained unchanged. Yet the path leading toward those commands often passed through conversations that left no record. In those conversations, the mistress had already helped shape how the husband saw the world around him. Emotional reliance slowly transformed quiet conversation into subtle participation in decision-making. What began as comfort during moments of uncertainty gradually shaped how the husband evaluated people, resources, and choices within the household. Once personal trust begins guiding judgment, influence can move quietly into places where authority eventually acts. Influence that grows quietly inside a household often appears stronger than it truly is. Conversations shape perceptions. Emotional closeness creates trust, and repeated presence allows certain voices to become familiar during moments of uncertainty. From the outside, such influence may seem steady and secure, yet unofficial influence rests on unstable ground. Unlike titles, inheritance rights, or written agreements, it carries no legal protection. The mistress may spend years close to the center of a man's private life, hearing his doubts, sharing his reflections, and gradually shaping the atmosphere surrounding his decisions. But none of this creates formal authority. Her presence leaves no mark on documents. No court recognizes her role within the household. The estate does not depend on her name or lineage. Every visible structure of power still belongs to others. This difference matters more than it first appears. The lawful wife possesses a position supported by law, religion, and tradition. Marriage records confirm her place within the household, and inheritance laws protect her children's claims to property and title. Even when personal relationships grow distant, the wife's legal status remains secure. The mistress exists outside that framework entirely. Her closeness depends on affection rather than obligation. The conversations that shape influence continue only as long as the husband chooses to maintain them. Nothing requires him to preserve that connection if circumstances change. Because of this, the foundation of her influence remains fragile. Years of intimacy may create the impression that her presence is permanent. The husband may rely on her voice when uncertainty arises, turning to her for reassurance or reflection. Within those moments, her influence can feel powerful and deeply rooted. Yet affection rarely guarantees permanence. Human relationships shift in ways that no one can fully control. New alliances, changing ambitions, or simple emotional distance may alter the balance within a household. What once felt natural can gradually lose its urgency. The mistress possesses no protection against such changes. If the husband grows distracted by political demands or family obligations, their conversations may occur less frequently. Moments of reflection that once included her presence may begin to happen elsewhere. This transformation rarely occurs suddenly. It begins with small absences. A conversation was postponed because of a meeting with advisors. An evening spent reviewing letters rather than speaking privately. Days pass, then weeks, and the rhythm of intimacy slowly weakens. The mistress often senses this shift before anyone else. Influence depends upon proximity to thought. When that proximity fades, the ability to shape perception fades with it. Words that once carried weight begin to sound less significant. Nothing about this loss appears dramatic. No official announcement declares the change. The husband continues managing the estate. The wife maintains her public authority. And society observes the household exactly as it always has. Yet the quiet center of influence has moved. The mistress may still occupy the same physical space within the household, but the emotional closeness that once sustained her presence has begun to weaken. Without that closeness, influence becomes little more than memory. Another danger lies within the nature of favor itself. Affection can be unpredictable. A man who once valued a particular voice may grow curious about another perspective. A new companion might appear, offering the same attention and emotional ease that once belonged to someone else. In such moments, influence transfers easily, because the mistress holds no recognized position. She cannot defend her place through authority or law. The same qualities that allowed her influence to grow quietly also allow it to disappear just as quietly. History rarely records these transitions. Documents preserve marriages, inheritances, and political alliances. Private relationships that shaped the emotional life of powerful men often vanish without a trace once they lose their relevance. The mistress may have influenced countless decisions during her time close to the husband's thoughts. Yet, when that closeness fades, nothing remains to protect the influence she once held. This fragility defines the true nature of unofficial power. It can shape perceptions, guide conversation, and affect decisions during the moments when it exists. At the same time, it depends entirely on the continuation of personal attention. Once that attention shifts, the entire structure collapses. The mistress may shape decisions through closeness and emotional influence. Yet none of that influence receives protection from law or tradition. Her position depends entirely on the continuation of favor that cannot be guaranteed or secured. Once affection changes direction, influence built through quiet presence can disappear as silently as it first appeared. Within the quiet structure of noble households, influence often carries an illusion of permanence. A person who is present during daily conversations, private reflections, and moments of uncertainty can gradually appear essential to the rhythm of another person's life. Presence creates familiarity. Familiarity slowly transforms into reliance. When the same voice accompanies many important moments, it begins to feel natural that the voice should always be there. The husband may come to expect the comfort of that presence without consciously recognizing how deeply it has entered his habits. This expectation can resemble necessity. The mistress listens when tensions rise within the estate. She hears frustrations about advisors, concerns about finances, and quiet doubts that never reach the ears of the lawful wife or formal counselors. Through repeated conversations, she becomes associated with relief from pressure. The husband grows accustomed to this relief. When a difficult letter arrives, or a troubling rumor spreads among neighboring families, he may instinctively seek the calm of the same familiar conversation. The mistress receives these moments as naturally as a routine that has existed for years. Gradually, she begins to appear indispensable. Her presence surrounds the emotional rhythm of the husband's life. Decisions seem easier to approach after speaking with her. Disappointments feel less severe when her voice provides reassurance. This closeness creates the impression that she cannot be replaced. Yet that impression often hides a different reality. Indispensable does not mean irreplaceable. It only describes the present moment. Shaped by habit and familiarity, the husband relies upon her because she is there, because their conversations have repeated themselves often enough to become part of his daily life. Habit can be powerful. The human mind grows comfortable with routines that provide stability during uncertainty. When the same person consistently listens and responds with patience, the relationship becomes woven into the pattern of everyday thought. But habits can change. Another presence may slowly enter the same space once occupied by the mistress. A new companion might offer the same attention, the same patience, the same willingness to listen without judgment. At first, the difference may appear small, a conversation shared with someone new during a moment of curiosity, a quiet exchange during a social gathering where thoughts are expressed freely without the expectations attached to older relationships. Over time, these small moments accumulate. The husband may discover that comfort does not belong to a single voice. Emotional reassurance can emerge from many sources, especially when those sources exist outside the rigid structures of duty and law. This realization quietly weakens the illusion of irreplaceability. The mistress may still hold an important place within the husband's thoughts, yet the foundation of that place rests on repetition rather than necessity. The relationship survives because it continues to exist, not because it cannot be recreated elsewhere. Noble households rarely acknowledge this distinction openly. Society observes only the visible framework of marriage and property. Private relationships unfold within hidden spaces where emotional habits shape influence far more than formal authority. Inside those hidden spaces, the difference between being necessary and being unique becomes increasingly clear. The mistress may feel central to the husband's life because she participates in moments of vulnerability that few others witness. She hears doubts that advisors never hear, and she offers comfort when responsibilities weigh heavily on him. These experiences create a powerful bond, yet the bond belongs to a particular period of time rather than to an unchangeable position. It exists because both individuals continue to sustain it through repeated attention. If circumstances shift, the bond may weaken. Distance, distraction, or new emotional connections can slowly alter the pattern that once seemed permanent. What once felt essential may gradually become only a memory of a previous habit. This fragility defines the difference between true necessity and temporary importance. The mistress may occupy the center of the husband's emotional life during a particular moment. Her presence may shape how he thinks, how he speaks, and how he approaches difficult decisions. Yet her place remains outside every system designed to preserve permanence. No law protects her position. No tradition guarantees that her closeness will endure. Her influence survives only as long as the habit that sustains it continues to exist. The mistress may appear indispensable because her presence becomes woven into the husband's daily habits and emotional routines. Yet habits create importance without guaranteeing permanence. Once the comfort of familiarity begins to shift toward another presence, what once felt essential can quietly become replaceable. Within noble society, position was one of the most carefully protected elements of life. Titles defined authority. Marriages confirmed legitimacy. And ceremonies displayed the structure that held families and estates together. Every visible sign of order reminded observers that each person occupied a place assigned by law. Lineage and tradition. The wife belonged firmly within that structure. Her presence during ceremonies confirmed the continuity of the family line. Guests recognized her authority when entering the household. Documents connected to property and inheritance carried her name as part of the legal foundation protecting the estate's future. Nothing about her position could easily be replaced. The mistress never attempted to challenge this visible order. She did not appear beside her husband during religious ceremonies. She did not participate in the formal gatherings where alliances between families were quietly strengthened through polite conversation and shared meals. Her role existed elsewhere. It unfolded within the quiet spaces of daily life, where the formal language of titles and property carried little meaning. These spaces rarely attracted attention from society, yet they often occupied the largest portion of a person's time. Morning conversations before the estate fully awakened. Quiet evenings, after the responsibilities of the day had finally ended. Moments when the husband felt free to speak without the careful restraint demanded by public expectations. The mistress often occupied these hours. She did not need to represent the household or preserve the dignity of family reputation. Without those obligations, her presence could remain relaxed and personal. Conversations moved easily between reflection, curiosity, and quiet observation. The husband experienced a different atmosphere in her company. Responsibilities that defined his role within the household seemed distant during these conversations. Instead of discussing formal obligations, he spoke about his own thoughts, frustrations, and ambitions. These exchanges gradually filled the emotional space surrounding his life. The lawful wife continued to represent stability and legitimacy. Her presence defined the public image of the household. Yet much of the husband's private time unfolded elsewhere, shaped by conversations that required no ceremony or recognition. Time has its own form of influence. The person who occupies the greatest share of everyday attention naturally begins to shape the emotional landscape of another's life. Familiar voices echo through memory, and repeated interactions form the rhythm through which thoughts and feelings develop. The mistress became part of that rhythm. Her presence accompanied the husband through many of the moments that filled ordinary days. She listened while he reflected on the difficulties of managing the estate. She responded when he questioned his own decisions. She remained nearby when frustration or uncertainty made the burdens of responsibility feel heavier than usual. Gradually, her presence filled the spaces between formal obligations. The wife remained the figure recognized by society, but the mistress often became the person whose company the husband sought when the duties of the household temporarily faded into the background. This difference rarely appeared dramatic. No open conflict disrupted the visible structure of marriage. The husband continued to appear beside his wife during ceremonies and social gatherings. Visitors entering the estate saw exactly what noble society expected to see. Yet emotional attention had shifted quietly. The husband might spend far more hours speaking freely with the mistress than with the wife, whose position defined the household's public order. Conversations that once occurred between husband and wife gradually moved into different spaces. This shift did not replace the wife's authority. Titles, property rights, and lineage remained unchanged. The legal framework supporting the marriage continued exactly as before. The wife still occupied the place that society recognized and respected. But emotional closeness followed a different path. The mistress never needed to stand beside the husband before an audience. Her influence existed within the time he chose to spend speaking openly, reflecting quietly, or simply escaping the pressure attached to his responsibilities. Presence slowly became more powerful than recognition. The husband might still honor the traditions connected to marriage, yet his thoughts returned repeatedly to the person who shared his private hours. Conversations with the mistress filled the mental spaces where worries softened and ambitions formed. She did not replace the wife's position. She replaced the emotional atmosphere surrounding the husband's daily life. This difference explains why unofficial influence can grow so quietly. Society continues to observe the structure of marriage, confident that nothing essential has changed. The wife remains visible, respected, and secure within the legal framework protecting her place. Meanwhile, emotional attention flows elsewhere. Time spent together becomes memory. Memory shapes thought. Thought influences decisions long before those decisions appear publicly. In this way, presence gradually becomes its own form of influence, not through titles, not through authority, but through the simple fact of being there during the hours that truly shape a person's inner life. The mistress never replaced the lawful position of the wife within the visible structure of marriage. She quietly occupied the hours, conversations, and reflections that filled the husband's private life. Once attention begins to gather around a different presence, the center of a man's thoughts may shift long before anyone recognizes the change. Life inside noble households often appeared calm and orderly to anyone observing from the outside. Ceremonies followed tradition. Estates operated with disciplined routine, and the visible structure of marriage preserved the dignity expected from families of influence. Guests attending gatherings rarely suspected how complicated the private lives of these households could become. Beneath that careful order, relationships sometimes formed that carried influence but lacked protection. A mistress might spend long hours in quiet conversation with the man who governed the estate. She could hear his doubts before advisors heard them, and she might offer comfort during moments when responsibilities weighed heavily on his thoughts. From a distance, such closeness could appear powerful. The husband might rely on her presence when facing uncertainty. He might share frustrations that never reached the ears of his lawful wife or the advisors surrounding him. Through repeated conversations, her voice could become familiar within the private space where his thoughts developed. Yet, this closeness existed without security. Unlike the wife, whose position rested on law, tradition, and family alliance, the mistress occupied a place that society refused to acknowledge formally. Marriage records protected the wife's role within the household. Property agreements often ensured her continued connection to the estate, even if affection between husband and wife faded. The mistress possessed no such protection. Her presence left no trace within legal documents. Her influence appeared nowhere in the agreements governing inheritance or property. Even if the husband trusted her voice deeply, society treated her existence as something temporary and unofficial. This difference created a constant risk. A noble household depended heavily on reputation. The dignity of the family's name influenced alliances, marriages, and financial opportunities. Because of this, appearances mattered enormously. As long as the visible structure of marriage remained intact, society often ignored what occurred in private spaces. Servants might notice the closeness between the husband and the mistress. Visitors could sense a familiarity that seemed unusual. Quiet rumors might circulate among relatives who preferred not to discuss what they suspected. Silence protected everyone involved. But silence could disappear quickly if a careless gesture drew attention, or if gossip spread too widely among neighboring families. The quiet tolerance surrounding the relationship could transform into criticism. The noble society protected its public values carefully. The wife's dignity always remained the priority. If a scandal threatened that dignity, the mistress became the easiest person to blame. Her reputation carried no legal protection. Society could condemn her behavior without destabilizing the formal structure of the household. This fragile balance placed the mistress in constant danger. She needed to remain close enough to her husband to maintain the relationship that gave her influence. At the same time, she had to remain discreet enough to avoid attracting attention from those who might turn curiosity into scandal. Every movement required caution. Conversations held in the wrong place might be overheard by servants. A gesture noticed by visiting relatives might spark rumors that spread beyond the estate. Reputation is balanced on small details, yet reputation represented only one form of vulnerability. The future itself remained uncertain. The lawful wife could depend on marriage to secure her position within the household. Even if emotional closeness faded between husband and wife, the legal bond remained intact. Property, inheritance, and family alliances ensured that her connection to the estate could not easily disappear. The mistress depended entirely on the continuation of affection. Her place existed only within the husband's personal attention. As long as he valued her presence, the relationship could continue quietly. Conversations would still occur, and her influence could remain part of his private reflections. But affection rarely remains unchanged forever. Responsibilities grow heavier with time. Political ambitions shift priorities. A man who once sought comfort in certain conversations may eventually turn his attention elsewhere. The change often begins subtly. Fewer private conversations take place. The husband spends more evenings occupied with advisors or correspondence. Days pass without the same easy companionship that once filled the quiet hours of the household. Gradually, the rhythm of closeness fades. Because the mistress holds no official position, she cannot prevent this transformation. She cannot appeal to law or tradition to defend her place within the household. Everything depends on the continuation of emotional attention. If that attention fades, the influence built through years of conversation may disappear almost without a trace. The husband continues his responsibilities. The wife continues to represent the household before society. The mistress simply becomes absent. History rarely records such disappearances. Documents remember marriages, property transfers, and political alliances. Private relationships that once shaped a man's emotional life often vanish from the record once they lose relevance. For the mistress, this reality forms the true cost of closeness without recognition. She may spend years near the center of a man's private thoughts, offering comfort and listening to the concerns that shape his decisions. Yet the foundation of that influence remains fragile from the beginning. Affection sustains it. Affection alone can end it. Closeness without recognition offers influence, but never guarantees safety. The mistress relies entirely on affection, rather than law or tradition, to maintain her place within the household. If that affection changes direction, the presence that once felt central can disappear with almost nothing left behind. History often remembers power through documents. Names appear in marriage records, property agreements, and political treaties that survive long after the individuals who signed them have disappeared. These written traces create the impression that influence always belonged to those whose authority was formally recognized. Yet the daily life of noble households rarely followed such simple patterns. Many decisions that shaped estates and alliances did not begin inside official documents. They began in quiet conversations, private reflections, and personal relationships that left no visible mark in the written record. Within those quiet spaces, people without official positions sometimes played a subtle role. A mistress, for example, might spend years close to the man responsible for guiding the household's affairs. She could hear his thoughts during moments of uncertainty and respond with observations that gradually shaped how he interpreted the world around him. Such influence rarely appeared dramatic. The mistress did not command servants or sign agreements transferring property between families. Her name did not appear beside the husband's in legal documents. To anyone reading the historical record centuries later, it might seem as though she never existed. Yet her presence could still shape outcomes. When a man reflects aloud about a difficult decision, the person who listens may quietly influence the direction his thoughts take. A simple remark about someone's character might linger in his memory when he later decides whom to trust. A question asked during a moment of uncertainty might encourage him to reconsider a choice he had nearly made. These moments leave no physical evidence. Documents record final decisions, not the conversations that shaped them. A historian studying property transfers might see the husband's signature, confirming a change within the estate. What remains invisible is the earlier discussion that influenced how the husband reached that conclusion. Because of this, the influence of unofficial figures often disappears from historical memory. The lawful wife remains visible because her position is recorded through marriage, inheritance, and lineage. Political advisors appear in correspondence and official reports. Family alliances leave traces within documents that historians can examine centuries later. The mistress belongs to a different category. Her presence exists primarily within private moments that were never intended to be recorded. Conversations held late in the evening, reflections shared during quiet walks, or emotional support offered during times of uncertainty vanish once those moments pass. Yet these experiences can shape decisions just as strongly as formal advice. A man may approach his responsibilities with greater confidence after speaking with someone who reassures him during moments of doubt. Encouragement offered privately can influence how boldly he acts when confronting political or financial challenges. Over time, such encouragement may contribute to outcomes that affect entire households. An estate might prosper because a decision was made with renewed confidence. A trusted advisor might gain influence because someone once suggested that he possessed loyalty others lacked. Even the direction of family alliances may shift because of subtle changes in how certain individuals are perceived. These consequences may appear in historical records, but the quiet influence that helped shape them often remains hidden. This absence creates a curious contrast within the study of history. Documents suggest that power was held only by those whose authority was formally recognized. Titles, signatures, and seals appear to define the boundaries of influence. Yet real human relationships frequently operate beyond those boundaries. The mistress represents one example of this hidden dimension. She may never appear in official records describing the management of an estate. Her voice leaves no trace within legal documents. Future generations reading the household's history may never know that she existed. Yet during her lifetime, she may have influenced the emotional atmosphere surrounding many decisions. Influence without recognition does not disappear entirely. It simply becomes difficult to see. The absence of documentation does not mean the absence of impact. Instead, it reveals the limits of the historical record itself. Written evidence captures only part of the forces shaping human behavior. Behind every document stands a network of conversations, relationships, and emotional connections that helped produce it. Many of those forces remain invisible. For individuals who lived outside official structures of authority, this invisibility defined their legacy. Their presence shaped moments of decision, yet their names rarely traveled beyond the private spaces where those moments occurred. The mistress may vanish from the written story of the household, but the quiet influence she once carried may still echo through the decisions recorded in its history. Influence that exists outside official recognition rarely appears within the documents that define historical memory. The mistress may shape thoughts and decisions without leaving any visible trace in the records describing those outcomes. When the final chapter of a household story is written, the forces that quietly guided many of its choices may remain forever unseen. In a noble society, the structure of marriage was designed to endure. Laws protected it, traditions reinforced it, and families relied on it to preserve property, lineage, and social standing. Even when personal relationships grew distant or complicated, the institution itself remained remarkably stable. The wife remained at the center of that visible structure. Her plurality within the household did not disappear simply because affection changed. She continued to appear beside her husband during ceremonies. Guests still greeted her as the lady of the estate. Servants continued to follow her authority in matters concerning the daily order of the household. From the outside, the system appeared complete and unchanged. Documents recorded the marriage. Property rights continued to connect her name to the estate. Family alliances remained secure because the lawful structure of the household still stood exactly where society expected it to stand. Nothing about the official arrangement had collapsed. Yet life inside the household followed a quieter reality. Emotional attention rarely obeyed the same rules that governed law and tradition. A man responsible for land, family reputation, and social expectations often carried private burdens that could not easily be expressed within the formal structure of marriage. In those moments, attention sometimes shifted elsewhere. The mistress never replaced the wife's lawful position. She never occupied the place reserved for the woman whose name appeared beside the husband's in marriage records and inheritance agreements. But she could replace something less visible. She could replace presence. Presence does not require ceremony or recognition. It simply requires time spent together, conversations shared during uncertain moments, and the quiet habit of turning toward the same person when thoughts become difficult to carry alone. Over time, such habits reshape emotional life. The husband may continue fulfilling his public duties beside his wife. He attends gatherings, receives visitors, and maintains the image of a stable marriage that society expects to see. Yet his thoughts may return repeatedly to the person who shares his private hours. The mistress may occupy the spaces where he reflects openly. She may hear his frustrations before advisors do. She may respond with encouragement that restores his confidence during moments when responsibility feels overwhelming. None of this alters the visible structure of the household. The wife remains the recognized partner. The estate continues operating according to established traditions. Observers attending gatherings still witness the same orderly arrangement they have always known. Yet emotional gravity has shifted quietly. The center of attention no longer lies solely within the marriage itself. Instead, it spreads into the private spaces where conversations occur without witnesses and decisions begin forming long before they become visible to others. This quiet shift rarely produces immediate conflict. Noble society values stability above personal transparency. As long as the lawful structure of marriage remains intact, many private realities remain unspoken. Guests continue attending dinners. Relatives exchange polite greetings. Servants maintain the rhythm of daily work throughout the estate. The system functions exactly as expected. But emotional influence often grows where visibility fades. The mistress becomes part of the husband's mental landscape. Her voice accompanies the thoughts that shape his understanding of people, loyalty, and trust. Conversations with her fill the hours that lie between formal obligations. Presence slowly becomes its own form of influence. Not because it replaces the wife's authority, not because it alters the legal structure of marriage, but it occupies the emotional spaces where a person's inner life unfolds. The wife preserves the stability of the household's visible order. The mistress shapes the atmosphere surrounding the man who lives within that order. Both roles exist simultaneously. One is recognized, the other is felt. This contrast explains why unofficial relationships often persist quietly for years without destroying the formal structure of noble society. Marriage protects the system. Presence shapes the heart of the man living inside that system. When viewed from the outside, nothing seems to change. The estate continues functioning. The family name retains its dignity. Visitors leave gatherings, convinced that tradition still governs every aspect of the household. Yet, inside the quieter spaces of everyday life, emotional attention may have already moved elsewhere. This difference between structure and feeling defines the hidden complexity of many historical relationships. The lawful wife stands firmly within the system designed to endure. The mistress moves within the invisible world of private companionship. Neither position completely replaces the other. Instead, they coexist within a delicate balance that noble society rarely acknowledges openly. And so, the story reaches its quiet conclusion. The wife remains. The household continues. The system stands exactly where it has always stood. Yet the center of emotional attention may belong to someone whose presence will never appear in the official history of the estate. The wife continues to hold the lawful position that preserves the household's visible order. The structure of marriage remains intact, supported by law, tradition, and social expectation. Yet the quiet center of emotional life may rest with someone whose presence history rarely chooses to remember. Good night. Thank you for spending this quiet time exploring the hidden rhythms of history. Stories like this remind us that history is not only shaped by kings, laws, and titles. It is also shaped by private conversations, by moments of uncertainty, and by the quiet presence of people who rarely appear in official records. Behind every document lies a human life filled with emotions, habits, and relationships that rarely leave written traces. The world of noble households may have seemed orderly from the outside. Yet inside those walls, people experience the same longings, doubts, and complicated bonds that exist in every era. Perhaps that is what makes these stories linger. They reveal that influence does not always belong to those who hold official positions. Sometimes it belongs to the person who listens carefully, who shares quiet hours with someone carrying heavy responsibilities, and who becomes part of the thoughts shaping important decisions. These lives rarely appear in the pages of formal history. but their presence shaped the atmosphere of countless households, guiding moments that eventually turned into the decisions historians later recorded. Tonight, as the lights grow softer and the world around you grows quiet, imagine those silent corridors of a distant estate. A candle burns low on a wooden table. Outside the windows, the night air rests over fields that have witnessed generations of lives and stories. Inside, conversations once unfolded that no document would ever capture. Whispers of uncertainty. Soft laughter eases the tension of difficult days. Moments of reflection that shaped choices affecting families and futures. All of it has faded into silence now. Yet the echoes remain in the stories we tell. History is filled with such quiet echoes. Voices that guided events, but were never written down. Presences that mattered deeply, but left no official trace. Perhaps that is why listening to these forgotten corners of the past can feel strangely peaceful. They remind us that human lives have always been more complicated, more emotional, and more fragile than the tidy structures recorded in books. And as you rest tonight, letting your thoughts drift gently away from the noise of the day, remember that history is not only the story of power, it is also the story of presence. The quiet presence of people who stood near the center of someone's life, shaping thoughts and emotions without ever stepping onto the official stage. Thank you for listening. Sleep well, and may the quiet stories of the past accompany you into a calm and peaceful night.